The morning fog hung thick over the Northumbrian coastline, rendering the boundary between sea and sky almost invisible. Inside Lindisfarne Monastery, monks moved through their morning rituals with practiced serenity. The island's isolation had long been its protection, a sanctuary separated from the mainland by tidal waters that twice daily rendered it inaccessible. But on this June morning in 793, the sea would bring not isolation, but terror. As dawn broke, shapes appeared in the mist, long, sleek vessels with high prows, moving with impossible speed. By the time the warning bell tolled across the Holy Island, the strangers from the north had already beached their ships on the shore. The dragons had come to Lindisfarne, and nothing in England would ever be the same again. Before we begin this journey into the Viking Age, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's always fascinating to see our community of history lovers spread across the world. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications. Every subscription helps us keep exploring the real stories behind the legends. Now, let's begin. To understand the shock that reverberated through Christian Europe following the Lindisfarne raid, we must first understand the world that existed before the Viking storm broke. By the late 8th century, the former Roman province of Britannia had transformed into a collection of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, each with their own rulers, customs, and territories. Northumbria, stretching from the Humber River to the Firth of Forth, had emerged as perhaps the most culturally sophisticated of these realms, boasting monastic centers of learning that preserved classical knowledge and produced remarkable works of art. The Lindisfarne Gospels, completed around 720, stand as a testament to this cultural flowering. Its illuminated pages with intricate interlaced patterns and vibrant colors represent hundreds of hours of painstaking labor by the monastery's scribes. The Gospel book exemplified the wealth concentrated in these religious centers, wealth in both material and intellectual terms. Gold leaf adorned its pages, precious gems studded its cover. The monastery itself held golden chalices, silver reliquaries containing saints' remains, and other treasures donated by Northumbrian nobility seeking divine favor. This monastic culture extended across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and into Ireland, creating a network of religious communities that exchanged manuscripts, ideas, and trained personnel. Monasteries like Jarrow, where the Venerable Bede wrote his ecclesiastical history of the English people, or Iona in Scotland, founded by the Irish missionary Columba, served as intellectual beacons in what continental Europeans still sometimes derided as the barbaric North. The decades preceding the Viking Age had seen relative stability in Anglo-Saxon England. While the kingdoms occasionally warred with each other and faced pressure from Welsh and Pictish neighbors, no existential threat had emerged since the Anglo-Saxon migration itself, centuries earlier. The seas surrounding Britain were viewed primarily as barriers rather than highways. Coastal defenses had atrophied, naval capacity had withered. The few ships that plied these waters were primarily trading vessels moving at a stately pace between established ports, not warships capable of sudden strikes against undefended targets. Across the North Sea, a very different world was taking shape. The lands we now call Scandinavia were neither unified kingdoms nor primitive backwaters. Archaeological evidence from trading centers like Hedeby in modern Denmark, Birka in Sweden, and Kaupang in Norway reveals sophisticated craft production, extensive trade networks, and significant social stratification. Excavations at Opokra in Sweden have uncovered a religious and political center that functioned continuously for over a millennium, with evidence of specialized craftsmanship and long-distance trade connections. The Norse homelands featured dramatic geographical contrasts. Norway's coastline, carved by glaciers into deep fjords, offered limited agricultural land but excellent harbors and access to rich fishing grounds. Denmark's flatter landscape provided better farming, but fewer natural resources. Sweden's territory stretched from Baltic coastal plains into the dense forests and mineral-rich mountains of the interior. These geographic differences shaped economic activities and, ultimately, the direction of Norse expansion. Norse society operated on principles quite distinct from the increasingly hierarchical structures of Christian Europe. At the local level, free farmers, carls, gathered in assemblies called things to resolve disputes, establish laws, and make communal decisions. The things represented a form of participatory governance that, while not democratic in the modern sense, gave ordinary free men a voice in community affairs. Above these, carls, stood the jarls, aristocratic leaders who maintained power through a combination of inherited status, personal prowess, and the loyalty of their followers. Below both were the thralls, slaves captured in combat or born into bondage. Family connections carried profound importance in Norse society. The concept of ættarskum, family shame, reveals how closely individual actions reflected on one's kin group. Honor and reputation functioned as social currency, more valuable than material wealth. This honor culture created powerful incentives for young men to prove themselves through feats of daring, whether in local conflicts or, increasingly, in expeditions abroad. Norse religious practices reflected this focus on reputation and achievement. While the myths of Odin, Thor, Freyr, and other gods are now familiar to many through popular culture, archaeological evidence suggests that religious practice varied considerably across the Norse world. Sacred sites ranged from elaborate temple structures at Uppsala in Sweden to simpler outdoor locations where offerings were made to local land spirits. Burial practices show similar diversity, from simple cremations to elaborate ship burials like those found at Oseberg and Gokstad. The Norse cosmos consisted of 9 interconnected worlds, with Midgard, the human realm, positioned between Asgard, realm of the gods, and Jotunheim, realm of the giants. This cosmology emphasized the precarious position of humans in a universe filled with both helpful and harmful powers. The Norse did not see their gods as omnipotent or morally perfect, but as powerful allies who faced their own limitations and eventual doom at Ragnarök, the prophesied end of the divine order. Perhaps most significantly for understanding the coming Viking expansion, Norse conceptions of the afterlife differed markedly from Christian beliefs. While Christianity promised salvation based on faith and moral conduct, Norse religion offered no such guaranteed paradise. Those who died of illness or old age faced a shadowy existence in hell. Only those slain in battle might be chosen by Valkyries to join the Einherjar in Valhalla, where they would feast and fight until called to stand with the gods at Ragnarök. This belief system created powerful incentives for warriors to seek glorious deaths rather than peaceful ones. Against this cultural backdrop, technological developments were laying the groundwork for unprecedented mobility. The Viking longship represented the culmination of centuries of Northern European shipbuilding evolution, combining elements that had never before appeared together in a single vessel. Archaeological finds, particularly the nearly intact ships preserved in Norwegian burial mounds, reveal their revolutionary design. The Oseberg ship, discovered in 1904 and dated to around 820 CE, demonstrates the artistic achievement of Norse shipwrights. Its gracefully curving hull, topped by an elaborately carved animal head prow, represented both functional engineering and symbolic power. The Gokstad ship, slightly later and larger, shows the mature form of the ocean-going longship. At 76 feet long, but just 17 feet wide, with a shallow draft of less than 3 feet, it could carry about 35 men while remaining fast and maneuverable. Several key innovations distinguished these vessels from anything that had come before. The overlapping planks of the clinker-built hull, secured with iron rivets, created a light but strong structure. Internal framing added after the hull was assembled allowed the ship to flex with waves, rather than fighting against them. A single square sail provided power on the open ocean, while oars allowed precise maneuvering in coastal waters and rivers. The symmetrical design with similar stem and stern posts meant the ship could reverse direction without turning around, crucial in narrow channels or when beaching. Most significantly, the Longship's combination of shallow draft and seaworthiness solved a fundamental problem that had limited northern European maritime activity: how to create vessels capable of both ocean voyages and river navigation. Earlier ships had specialized in one environment or the other. The Longship could sail from Norway to England, then navigate far inland via rivers, enabling raids against targets that had previously felt secure in their inland locations. These technological capabilities were matched by navigational expertise that modern scholarship has only recently begun to appreciate fully. Without magnetic compasses, Norse sailors relied on a combination of celestial observation, awareness of prevailing winds and currents, migration patterns of birds, and close attention to subtle changes in wave patterns, cloud formations, and watercolor. The possible use of a sunstone, polarizing crystal, to determine the sun's position on cloudy days remains debated, but represents the kind of innovative solution Norse navigators might have employed. What transformed these technological capabilities into a force that would reshape European history? Environmental and social pressures within Scandinavia provide part of the answer. Climate data derived from ice cores, tree rings, and lake sediments indicates a warming period in the 8th century that likely increased population growth, followed by cooling in the 9th century that may have reduced agricultural yields. This climate fluctuation could have intensified competition for limited arable land, particularly in western Norway's narrow valleys. Political consolidation added another push factor. The late 8th century saw the emergence of more powerful kings attempting to extend their control over previously independent regions. As these kings consolidated power, defeated rivals and their followers needed new opportunities. Foreign raiding and later settlement provided both escape from domination at home and chances to establish new power bases abroad. Economic motives certainly played a crucial role. The enormous quantities of silver that flowed north during the Viking Age, visible in the thousands of coins found in hoards across Scandinavia, transformed Norse economies and social structures. This wealth financed further expeditions, enabled ambitious leaders to attract followers through gift-giving, and eventually contributed to state formation in the Scandinavian homelands. Yet none of these factors fully explains the specific timing and targets of early Viking raids. Why did Norse expansion begin dramatically in the 790s rather than decades earlier or later? Why target remote religious centers rather than wealthier trading settlements? The answers likely involve a combination of opportunity recognition and information flow. Initial exploratory voyages revealed the vulnerability of isolated yet wealthy monasteries. News of successful raids spread rapidly through Norse trading networks, creating a cascade effect as more groups organized expeditions. The first documented Norse raid on England struck Lindisfarne on June 8, 793. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records, "In this year, fierce foreboding omens came over the land of the Northumbrians, and the wretched people were shaken. There were excessive whirlwinds, lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky." These signs were followed by great famine, and a little after those that same year, on 8th June, the ravaging of wretched heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne. The raid itself likely involved a relatively small force, perhaps 3 ships carrying fewer than 100 warriors. They struck without warning, likely arriving at dawn when the causeway to the mainland would have been covered by high tide, cutting off escape routes. The monastery's wealth was concentrated in its church. Golden altar vessels, silver reliquaries, jeweled book covers, and other religious artifacts that represented decades of patronage from Northumbrian nobility. For the Norse raiders, these items were simply valuable objects for the taking. For the monks, they were sacred treasures associated with saints and imbued with spiritual power. This cultural disconnect added another dimension of horror to the attack. Contemporary accounts describe the raiders as not merely stealing wealth, but desecrating holy places, trampling consecrated hosts, destroying altars, and showing contempt for Christian symbols. Some monks were killed, others dragged to the ships as captives destined for slave markets across the Norse world. Still others managed to flee with portable treasures like the Lindisfarne Gospels, which survived the raid. The monastery itself, while damaged, was not completely destroyed, and monastic life would eventually resume there. But something fundamental had changed in the European consciousness. The sea was no longer a barrier, but a highway for terror. The psychological impact of the Lindisfarne raid extended far beyond Northumbria. Alcuin of York, a Northumbrian scholar serving at Charlemagne's court on the continent, wrote to King Ethelred of Northumbria, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race, nor was it thought possible that such an inroad from the sea could be made. Behold, the church of St. Cuthbert spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments." Alcuin's letter reveals the conceptual rupture the raid represented. The attack violated not merely physical security, but the worldview through which Anglo-Saxon Christians understood their reality. Lindisfarne was supposed to be protected by St. Cuthbert, its patron saint. Its violation suggested a failure of divine protection that required explanation. Alcuin and others interpreted the raid as divine punishment for moral failings among the Northumbrians, particularly their rulers. Consider carefully, brothers, and examine diligently, lest perchance this unaccustomed and unheard-of evil was merited by some unheard-of evil practice. Consider the dress, the way of wearing the hair, the luxurious habits of the princes and people. This interpretive framework, seeing Viking raids as divine punishment rather than simply human aggression, would persist throughout the Viking Age. It reflected the deeply religious worldview of the chroniclers, but also their struggle to comprehend why such attacks were happening and why traditional defenses, both physical and spiritual, seemed powerless to prevent them. The initial raid was followed by others. In 794, the monastery at Jarrow was attacked, though sources indicate the raiders suffered losses in this instance. By the early 9th century, raids had extended to Ireland, Scotland, and Frisia. The Annals of Ulster record the first Norse raids on Ireland in 795, targeting Rathlin Island and Iona. Each successful raid brought back wealth that financed further expeditions and attracted more participants. What began as small-scale opportunistic attacks evolved into a systematic pattern of seasonal raiding. For coastal communities throughout Western Europe, this new threat demanded immediate adaptation. Monasteries began moving valuable objects inland or constructing defensive works. Some relocated entirely to less vulnerable locations. Coastal watchtower networks were established in some regions. Church liturgy incorporated prayers for protection from the fury of the Northmen. Kings began commissioning the construction of defensive burhs, fortified settlements designed to provide refuge during attacks. Yet these defensive measures often proved inadequate against the speed and unpredictability of Norse raids. The psychological impact may have outweighed the physical damage. The raiders seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with overwhelming force, and vanish before an effective response could be organized. This created a sense of helplessness and terror that contemporary chronicles capture vividly. An Irish monk wrote, "The sea spews forth floods of foreigners over Erin, so that no haven, no landing place, no stronghold, no fort, no castle might be found, but it was submerged by waves of Vikings and pirates." The written sources we possess from this period come almost exclusively from the victims, Christian clerics who interpreted the raids through a religious lens. Archaeological evidence provides some corrective to these biased accounts, showing Norse culture as sophisticated rather than primitive. But archaeology cannot fully capture the lived experience of either raiders or victims. We must piece together a balanced understanding from these fragmentary and often contradictory sources. What seems clear is that the early raids opened pathways for much more extensive Norse activity. The initial success of small raiding parties demonstrated the vulnerability of wealthy coastal sites throughout Western Europe. This knowledge spread rapidly throughout Scandinavia, creating a feedback loop that accelerated the frequency and scale of expeditions. Returning raiders brought not just material wealth, but valuable intelligence about potential targets, defensive capabilities, and navigational routes. The economic impact of these early raids extended in both directions. For the targeted communities, the loss of treasure accumulated over generations represented a significant economic blow, but perhaps more damaging was the atmosphere of insecurity that disrupted trade networks and agricultural production. Farmers fearful of raids might abandon coastal fields, merchants might avoid previously active trading routes. For Scandinavian societies, the influx of plundered wealth, particularly silver, transformed local economies. Archaeological evidence shows a dramatic increase in silver circulation in Scandinavia beginning in the late 8th century. This wealth enabled ambitious leaders to attract followers through gift-giving, finance shipbuilding, and establish new power bases. The raid-based economy created its own momentum, drawing more participants as stories of successful expeditions spread. By the mid-9th century, what had begun as seasonal raiding had evolved into more permanent Norse presence in many regions. In England, the Great Heathen Army arrived in 865, wintering in East Anglia before conquering Northumbria and establishing the region later known as the Danelaw. In Ireland, Norse settlers established coastal trading towns like Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick. In Francia, Vikings sailed up the Seine to besiege Paris multiple times. In the east, Swedish Rus established trade networks along Russian rivers, reaching as far as Constantinople. This transition from raid to settlement reflected changing Norse objectives. Where early raiders sought primarily portable wealth, later waves sought land, trade opportunities, and political power. Many were no longer outsiders making quick strikes, but settlers establishing new communities, intermarrying with local populations, and eventually adopting local religions and customs while maintaining distinctive Norse cultural elements. The archaeological record reveals this evolution clearly. Early Viking sites in England, Ireland, and elsewhere show distinctively Scandinavian artifacts and building styles. Over time, these give way to hybrid forms that blend Norse and local traditions. At Coppergate in York, the Viking city of Jorvik, excavations reveal a thriving urban center where Norse and Anglo-Saxon cultural elements mixed to create something new. The written record shows a similar pattern of cultural exchange. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle initially describes the Norse in entirely negative terms, as heathens and plunderers. By the late 9th century, it acknowledges them as settlers, and eventually as converted Christians. In the Irish annals, a similar evolution occurs, with Vikings initially described as foreign devastators, but gradually recognized as integral parts of Ireland's political and economic landscape. This process of acculturation worked both ways. While Norse settlers eventually adopted Christianity and many local customs, they also introduced distinctive elements of Scandinavian culture, visible today in place names, legal concepts, linguistic influences, and genetic heritage. The hundreds of English place names ending in by Thorpe and Thwaite-mark areas of intensive Norse settlement and still dot the maps of Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and other regions of the Danelaw. Legal codes from this period show similar evidence of Norse influence. Concepts like the hrepr, a form of mutual insurance community, and various compensation tariffs for injuries found their way into local legal systems. The jury system itself may have Norse roots, with some scholars tracing it to the Norse Thing assemblies rather than Anglo-Saxon or Norman precedents. Linguistically, the Norse left a profound mark on English. Common words like sky, egg, law, husband, window, and leg derive from Old Norse. More fundamentally, some scholars argue that contact between Old English and Old Norse closely related but distinct Germanic languages, accelerated the simplification of English grammar, helping transform it from a highly inflected language to its more analytically structured modern form. The later Viking Age saw the emergence of more organized Norse kingdoms and the gradual adoption of Christianity in Scandinavia itself. Denmark became Christian under Harald Bluetooth in the late 10th century. Norway's conversion came under Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson around the turn of the millennium. Sweden's conversion was more gradual, with significant pagan practices persisting in some regions into the 12th century. Christianity brought with it Latin literacy and stronger connections to continental European political structures. The Viking kings increasingly modeled themselves on Christian European monarchs, establishing mints, standardizing laws, and building churches. This political consolidation at home coincided with the gradual absorption of Viking settlements abroad into local political structures. By the late 11th century, the distinctive Viking Age was drawing to a close. The Norman conquest of England in 1066, itself led by descendants of Norse settlers in France, is often used as a convenient end marker for the period, though Norse activity continued in the Scottish Isles, Ireland, and the eastern Baltic for generations afterward. What remained was a complex legacy that continues to shape our understanding of the medieval period. The terrifying raiders described in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Alcuin's letters became, in many regions, settlers whose descendants intermarried with local populations. Norse influence remains visible in place names throughout Northern Europe, in linguistic patterns, in genetic heritage, and in cultural memory. The longships that once brought terror eventually facilitated exploration of the North Atlantic, leading to the settlement of Iceland around 870, brief colonization of Greenland beginning around 985, and even temporary outposts in North America at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland around the year 1000, 5 centuries before Columbus. Norse traders established routes that connected Western Europe to the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, bringing new goods, technologies, and ideas into circulation. Perhaps most enduringly, the Vikings entered the European imagination as symbols of both terror and adventure. Their image has been repeatedly reinvented according to the needs of later periods, as noble savages during the Romantic era, as proto-democratic freemen for 19th century nationalists, as helmeted berserkers for Hollywood. Each generation finds in the Vikings a mirror for its own preoccupations. The historical reality was more complex than any of these simplified images. The Norse were neither uniquely violent by the standards of their time nor romantic freedom lovers. They were products of specific historical circumstances who adapted creatively to opportunities and constraints. Their expansion transformed not just the lands they raided and settled, but Scandinavia itself, accelerating political consolidation and eventually integration into Christian Europe. The shock that rippled through Europe after Lindisfarne reflected more than just the physical damage inflicted. It marked a collision between different conceptions of value, different understanding of conflict, different worldviews. The monks who died defending sacred objects against men who saw only their material worth embodied a cultural disconnect that would gradually narrow as the Viking Age progressed, but which initially created profound trauma. For the people of 8th century Britain, who had come to see the sea as a barrier rather than a highway, the sudden appearance of dragon-headed ships on the horizon represented not just a physical threat, but a conceptual rupture, a reminder that the world could still contain surprises, that established patterns could be broken in a single morning by the arrival of strangers from across the northern waters. Looking back across the centuries, we can see how that moment of shock and violence eventually gave way to cultural exchange, settlement, and integration. The Vikings who arrived as raiders would, in many cases, remain as neighbors. Their longships, initially instruments of terror, would become vehicles for exploration that expanded European knowledge of the world. The gold they seized from monasteries would finance trading networks that eventually connected cultures across vast distances. In the end, the lesson of the Viking Age is not simply about violence and conquest, but about the complexity of cultural interaction, how conflict can lead to exchange, how outsiders can become insiders, how technologies developed for one purpose can find unexpected applications. The Saxons, who once mocked the possibility of Norse raids, would eventually absorb Norse settlers into their communities, creating hybrid cultures that preserved elements of both traditions. The sea that had seemed a barrier became a connector, and the world grew larger in ways that neither the monks of Lindisfarne nor the first raiders could have imagined.